Elon Musk said on Twitter that, to quote, the F-35 design was broken at the requirements level because it was required by too many things to too many people, and that manned fighter jets are obsolete in the age of drones anyway, will just get pilots killed. So I was wondering, maybe a good way to start would be to get your thoughts on that. Do you think that there's any truth in this?
Uh, I mean, there are elements of truth that he is sort of clearly drawing on in forming his opinions. So, for example, he mentions that the plane aircraft, in this case the F-35, was required to do too many things by too many people. Well, certainly the aircraft has some design compromises from the fact that short takeoff and vertical landing was required by the Marine Corps version, the Bravo, which the UK also operates, but that they wanted design commonality as far as possible with the conventional takeoff and the carrier, that takeoff and landing version, the C as well. Um, and that did, push choices in terms of the shape of the aircraft and some of the internal layout that you might not want to do if you were just going for a conventional land-based aircraft, for example. So you can see in that example where there are some choices that were made 20 years ago plus at this stage, which he's clearly read about at some point or heard about and is referencing. Um, and there are also increasing amounts of possibility offered by high-end uncrewed systems. So the US Air Force would call them advanced autonomous combat platforms, or ACPs. Sorry, that's the Royal Air Force would call them ACPs, autonomous collaborative platforms. The US Air Force would call them CCAs, so collaborative combat aircraft. Essentially, these are things that start off potentially relatively small and end up as big as you want, uh, looking to do different classes of supplementary capability alongside fighter aircraft or other combat aircraft with uncrewed systems to hopefully do things a bit more cheaply. But none of those are anywhere close to being able to replace the totality of what a piloted aircraft gives you, particularly a very advanced one like the F-35. And so, yeah, for someone who works in the industry and has done for a while, you can see kind of threads of where Elon Musk's statement is kind of drawing on things that have some basis in reality. But for example, in that particular tweet thread that he kicked that F-35 intervention off with, it started with a couple of images of a very large, essentially drone swarm display by a Chinese organization, and that was his sort of starting point to say, when you look at these things, I think his words were, anyone still investing in piloted fighter aircraft is an idiot, or words to that effect. And the problem with that sort of approach is that um, anything small and cheap enough to mass in those quantities, even with all the clever AI-enabled or swarming things you might want to do, anything that is cheap enough will be so small that it by definition can't go very far. And so where I think there probably has been a very significant change in the way that warfare will need to be fought, or at least what forces will need to be prepared to do, from massed small UAVs, is actually not in the air domain with traditional fighter aircraft like the F-35, but it's actually in the land domain where you're seeing where those ranges are much shorter. So, between different frontline areas, for example, yes, those small UAVs can be massed in huge numbers, as we see in Ukraine. But if you're looking at, for example, the US military's requirements for the F-35, which one of the major criticisms of it within the US military is that it doesn't necessarily have the range that they need in the Indo-Pacific. Well, an F-35A will push about 600 nautical mile combat radius, unrefueled. And so that's assuming you're not doing air-to-air refueling. A small quadcopter with the most efficient batteries you're currently looking at, that might be $2,000 or $3,000 with a small warhead and sensor feed or whatever, would be lucky to push 10 kilometers. So, and that's one way, not necessarily not coming back. So, I think what Musk's position on fighter aircraft being sort of non-viable because of what uncrewed systems are allowing you to do these days. Firstly, perhaps skipped over the importance of range, distance, payload, cost. If you want an uncrewed system to do the sort of things that you currently use fighter aircraft like the F-35 to do, over the ranges that you require them to do it at, particularly the US and the Indo-Pacific, more so than, say, European countries, then you could do some of those things with an uncrewed system, but that uncrewed system will have to go hundreds of miles, and most of them can't air-to-air refuel. If you want it to be able to air-to-air refuel, then you're still dependent on a big tanker, and also your complexity just went up hugely for what you need in that system from a sensor and control laws point of view. You pretty rapidly end up with uncrewed systems that are at about the same size as fighter aircraft. They might be different shapes, but about the same size, which can be a bit more efficient because you don't have to have a cockpit in there, and therefore you can use more internal space for fuel and all that sort of thing. But you trade off additional software and sensor complexity because you need it to be able to see and do more stuff without the benefit of a human being able to be that interpretive layer and also having eyes and a head and an ability to look around. And the human eye in particular is very good at foveating, so focusing attention on very, very specific bits of a field of view with incredibly short frame times, essentially. So if you imagine in a fighter pilot context, if you go into a visual fight of something going past you, which actually happens quite often, even though the majority of state-on-state conflict assumes the majority of long-range, a lot of engagements would be long-range, beyond visual range with missiles. Particularly as you move to a stealth aircraft on both sides, people are detecting each other later as they come towards each other. So often you are getting mergers. So when aircraft come into visual range, in increasingly in, for example, major exercises as fifth gen starts, so F-35 starts being used by red adversary players as well as blue. So you might get into visual range. But also if you're air policing on a disputed border, for example, next to each other before something kicks off, you sort of start in visual range almost by definition. So if you imagine that, for example, of two aircraft going past one another, as they flash past, the human eye and brain will focus as you turn your head to watch it go past, will focus subconsciously on things like control deflection. So even if you don't see him start to turn as he goes past you left or right or pull up or maybe flip to go down, even if you don't quite see that, you might well subconsciously pick up control deflections, which with enough experience, an experienced fighter pilot will be able to essentially know, okay, so they're going left or they're going right or they're going up, and therefore start their own turn to respond to that. So depending on whatever they think their comparative advantages and disadvantages are, they will then respond accordingly. For an AI-powered aircraft to do that, so I'd be fascinated to know, for example, what the recent F-16 that they adapted and Frank Kendall went up in, that can dogfight. I'd be fascinated to know what its inputs are, because as far as I'm aware, cameras don't yet exist that can do that 3D tracking with a sufficiently high visual or pixel clarity to get that level of indicator from something which for a machine would be an incredibly tiny part of the overall image. But a human will naturally kind of focus on where they need to focus and even just do the processing subconsciously. Because, of course, for a traditional fighter like an F-16, if the AI is only using the sensors on the jet, then it only really has view forward. And so once you go past each other, the AI will then essentially be blind, unless it has a data link to another source of information, which I suspect they probably did in those tests, to tell them where the opponent is when the opponent is outside of the sensor cone. And so if you were to do a 3D camera that had that kind of resolution, you would have huge bandwidth requirements for it and very specific programming. And you'd need it in an aperture system like the EOTS system on the F-35, which is a 360 degree electro-optical system. But that, as far as I'm aware, does not give you that level of high definition fidelity up close. It's brilliant at detecting and tracking objects far away and heat signatures far away, much better than the human eye. But I guess what I'm getting at is even in the relatively simple scenario of a dogfight, which is generally where uncrewed systems are, particularly AI-enabled pilot programs are currently tested, is in what's called basic fighter maneuvers, BFMs, dogfights, one-on-one, which is about as simple as it gets. Yes, you can get to a point where the AI is consistently beating human pilots by training against itself and other pilots. But there's actually a huge amount of real-world complexity involved and difficulty involved in making that reliable and practical in the real world, in all circumstances, before you ever get close to scaling up to much larger and more complex mission sets, where there's all sorts of inputs that and tasks that a pilot is doing, most of which are not actually combat inputs. They are dealing with unexpected stuff, dealing with human air traffic control, dealing with civilian traffic, parsing rule of engagement changes, doing mission planning, air-to-air refueling, comms within not just their own squadrons aircraft, other squadrons that are contributing assets to the composite air operation, including probably some assets from other countries. That if you have an AI now, it needs to be able to adapt to work with not just your own Air Force's ecosystem, but actually other air forces that you're allied with. And basic stuff like if you're in the pattern on an airfield, how do you deal with somebody doing the wrong thing in the pattern and somebody landing on the wrong runway or somebody turning off onto your taxiway as all of these things are things that human beings don't necessarily think a huge amount about because we are very good at unexpected contextual adaptation, even though we're not nearly as good at crunching huge amounts of data. But for something to replace what you do with fast jets in its entirety, you have to be able to handle all of those things. And therefore, the programming complexity and the data set complexity and the sensor complexity that you need to build into an uncrewed system is actually enormous. And so what you very quickly end up with is something about the size of a fighter aircraft that is actually significantly less flexible, even though it might be better at the cutting edge, that still costs a few tens of millions of dollars. And you certainly can't mass by the thousands in some sort of swarm because of the cost. It's a very long-winded answer, but essentially, no, Elon is not correct. And what's a shame is that there's a lot of nuance within the stuff that he's clearly pulling on to inform his view that's really interesting, really important, and where radical thinking can deliver significant improvements. But the secret sauce, as it were, in all the different countries that are experimenting, and they are experimenting with these uncrewed systems for using as traditional air power stand-ins, the secret sauce is that they're not a replacement for the crewed systems. They are an augmentation for the crewed systems and for your traditional standoff weapons. A lot of your weapons as well are already actually lethal, autonomous, uncrewed long-range systems. So like a cruise missile, a modern cruise missile actually has a huge amount of lethal autonomy capability baked into it to detect, prioritize, and choose targets and attack them automatically or autonomously. They can communicate with other weapons in a swarm in some cases. You've already got things like the miniature air launch decoy X, so Mold X, which does some really interesting jamming and spoofing and can do some other stuff, but can loiter for hours inside enemy territory. It looks like a cruise missile, but it's actually, if you developed it from a drone company, people would say that is a very advanced, stealthy, uncrewed jet drone system. But it's actually, because it's been developed from a line of systems, the Air Launch Decoy 160, ADM 160 series, It's just seen as a weapon. Um, there's a huge amount of benefit here, but it's fulfilling niche roles to augment the crude systems that you can't have enough of because of the cost and pilot training and all of that stuff. And I guess the only other thing to ask when you look at this stuff, even if one doesn't want to go into all the technical side of things, is, well, okay, why are the Chinese still building hundreds of fighter jets and developing a next generation piloted fighter jet? Why are the Russians still building fighter jets? Why is every European country that currently makes fighter jets looking at building a new fighter jet as well as buying more? And why has almost every country that has been allowed to look at it behind the black curtain, so to speak, so been allowed to look into some of the more classified capabilities and compare them to other aircraft on the market, why have almost every single one that's been allowed to look gone for the F-35? Because it's not just political alignment with America. In some cases, that was the key thing, but in a lot of cases, and I've seen some of the metrics on some of those competitions, yeah, there's a very, very good reason why countries that require an ability to operate in contested airspace, if they have the option, almost exclusively buy the F-35 and have done for 10 years. It's not the most efficient aircraft for a whole host of other things. So if you don't require the ability to penetrate into defended airspace and do things, particularly going after ground-based air defense systems, then actually, if you just want to do air defense, for example, across relatively short ranges and then maybe a little bit of air policing, then an F-35 is actually quite an inefficient thing to choose. You would be much better off buying something much cheaper to operate and to purchase, that's simpler, easier to maintain, has wider weapon options potentially, although actually F-35, if you go external, has quite a lot of weapon options as well. But something like the Saab Gripen or Eurofighter or a modernized F-16 or Rafale or whatever, all of which have their own different skews and balances towards different capabilities. But yeah, if you want to go into other people's defended airspace at range, the F-35 is still the best capability out there. And every single country that has had the option to buy it, that has those requirements, has bought the F-35 over other stuff. So it would be surprising if Elon had, before he's allowed access to any of the high classification data on it, come to a much better outcome analytically than all of those countries and the DoD for all of these competitions. Despite the fact that he's right, there are lots and lots of flaws in the F-35 program and base design spec.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. It's launching from January, it's completely free, and you can already sign up so that you receive the first edition. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed.